welcome to Combat Thoughts. I'm Robbie.
I'm Lee.
And I'm Alex.
We're going to take a deeper look at culture and philosophy behind martial arts. So we're talking about rule sets and how it influences style. I think to branch out from just MMA, we can talk about stuff about like Muay Thai versus K1, for example, and the differences there. But the real obvious one to talk about recently, which actually I came up with a podcast idea before this, so it just fits absolutely perfectly. Mighty Mouse get a knee in the head and finished.
I'm looking particularly shocked about it.
You are or you aren't?
No, he did. Like he was. You could see afterwards there was like what the fuck just happened? His eyes were like beaming, and he was like, you could see he'd probably like in passing forgotten the rule.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it's not just going to be about forgetting the rule. I mean, it's going to be quite a hard shift because I reckon a lot of these guys just run on instinct for the most part. Mm-hmm. And how long has Mighty Mouse been doing it? How many fights is he in, do you think?
20.
You can look 30s. At right? If you've done it 20 or 30 times, and every time you're like, okay, so what do? Make distance, put it down. Mm-hmm. You're not going to think it through. You're not going to, like, most of the time, when you're, I think, when you're that much of a professional, you've been fighting for that long, it's just reactionary. So not that surprising that, it came as a bit of a shock for him.
I mean, he was also rocked as well before it, so it's like that fight or flight kicks in. So I completely agree with what you said, but it kind of amplifies it a bit more that you've been rocked, so you're only going on instinct at that point. Because that's like the big thing, isn't it? Like strikers become wrestlers when they get rocked because like their instinct's just to grab hold. And I think what happened was he got hit, he got hurt, and then just wanted to get up and got kneed. I suppose I think there's a bigger change in the rule set from like the good old days of UFC MMA to now, as opposed to like one versus UFC, because Mighty Mouse isn't in his gym kneeing people in the face when they're on all fours, is there?
Oh, I mean, no, I fucking hope not, at least.
Yeah. And no one is kneeing him, so which is probably the more important thing.
But it's going to be more about the fact that he's drilled a particular movement thousands of times. But I do agree with what you said, though, Lee, because I don't think it actually changes the... I don't think it changes the sport that much. Mm-hmm. And the reason I think that is... or it's not just one. It seems to be a real, like, Asian MMA thing, because it's one... Rising, it was Pride back in the day. Yeah. I don't know any other Asian organizations, so I haven't got any more evidence to back up my claim. But it does seem to be that. Whereas Cage Warriors and everyone else follow exactly what the UFC does, right? However,
because the West is more, we are more, sophisticated, of course.
That's absolute bullshit. The West is subservient to the UFC. You do everything you want, so the UFC become you want to be the feeder league to the UFC in Europe, right? So you fight the same rules. Like Asia, like you look at one are kind of two fingers up. We're going to do it ourselves. Like they're doing it to differentiate.
I'm totally kidding. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, like one seems to be a lot more sophisticated than the UFC in a lot of ways. So,
but you know what I think though is that the fights don't actually look all that different in one.
No,
it's not actually that big of a rule change. It's some very specific areas where that happens. I don't think that particular rule actually changes things a great deal, unless
12 to 6 elbows still too dangerous in one as well.
Yeah. I think the only difference between one and the UFC rules is the knees to the head. You can't even soccer kick, just knees.
Okay.
Because I mean, the last time they had soccer kicks, the guy. It wasn't good. There's a video of it online, and it is pretty. It's pretty.
Very anti soccer kick. Like, I think it's unnecessary.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I actually do quite like the knees to the head on the ground, but only because
I don't mind the knees to the head, and I'm happy with that. And I think 12 to 6 elbows is fine. I think soccer kick is one too far for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's for the same reason that you don't allow like hits to the back of the head. Like there is a point where you're like, right, this is an actual problem in safety risk. Least the heads seem okay though, but the fights don't look all that different. And actually, there's very easy fixes for it. I mean, Alex, you won't know this, but like Marvin, our coach, used to teach us to always do get ups like this, which is sort of almost like dabbing, like of your hand across there, mostly against punches. But it's a very easy fix, and it wouldn't have changed our style all that much. I think you're right about the old UFC and those rules being a much more of a change to the modern day rules, and that's what really makes the change in the styles versus those small changes that we've got nowadays.
We're talking about the rules, and I just tangentially as well, because I agree with what you said. I remember listening to a few people talk about when they moved from UFC to Bellator, and it was the rounded cage, and that threw people off as well. So is it not just the rules, it's the location? Because there's a big thing around fighting in a ring versus fighting in a cage, and how people struggle with that in cage wrestling.
Oh yeah. Well, that has a massive impact because I mean, talk to Danaher and he'll split it up to say clinch, ground, shoot boxing, cage work, and he considers that an entire separate part of the MMA meta. And I'm inclined to agree.
Yeah.
Take that away, massive difference. There's like the takedowns change so much. Like how much time do you spend like drilling takedowns, takedown defense on the cage? It just doesn't work on the ropes.
Yeah.
That's
I mean, there are some extreme cases of rule set variation in like the sport of MMA itself. One like example that comes to mind for me is, have you heard of the organization? The name escapes me, but it's essentially like a teams based MMA thing where it's like basically like a rectangle, and you just have to go head on with the other
Yeah,
person.
I've seen that.
Do we have to
I mean,
give
yeah,
this stuff
it's
props
borderline like, what's that?
Should we be giving this stuff props on the internet? I think this should be lost in the obscurity of YouTube.
Mate, they attract some pretty big crowds.
Is this a Polish promotion?
No, it's Russian, so
yeah, but I
pretty
also
close.
think if there was like fights to the death, some idiots would still go. So I mean, it doesn't really give it justification for tag team MMA.
You make a good point though, because I've seen in tag team MMA, you know what happens is that despite the fact that a lot of them are a lot more amateur than professional fighters, and you know, okay, so amateur fights do tend to be won by the grappler, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because people can't maintain distance, it's quite a sophisticated skill to learn. The grapplers end up winning the fights, but you know what happens in team MMA? Completely flips it on its head.
Yeah, that's true.
Because the trouble is that I remember seeing a boxing team versus a Ju-Jitsu team, and all the Ju-Jitsu guys, like, unless they take them down and get on top of them, what happens is they end up tussling on the ground, and as soon as one of the boxers like finishes and looks at his mates, just like holding out, just runs over and just punts the other guy in the head.
Yeah,
The
it's
team-based
the same thing
setting.
if you ever speak to people who like work the doors, so doing jiu-jitsu for ages, you always kind of see the bouncers who come in and train. You speak to them. I remember speaking to this old guy, and he was like fuck do I need jiu-jitsu? He's like, I'm not pulling guard in the middle of the street if people are kicking off. And he says it's very similar. It's the do what's right in the space around you rather than what's technically good practice.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's it, isn't it? Like the cage and the environment is like the biggest change. Like it's cage versus ring, or whether it's team based or like versus individual. That's the biggest change. But there are like smaller things you can change, which have a huge influence on the rule set. Like consider the gloves.
Yep.
Like,
Yeah.
if you took away the gloves, everyone knows everyone would start breaking their hands all the time. Far few people will be punching. It's those choices in rule set that really swing it towards being a striking heavy sport.
I think it's also like if we can consider this as part of the rules, I guess to some extent it can be, but like the size of the the place where the fight takes place, that can also influence style. And we've seen it with the fact that a lot of the fights are now in the UFC Apex, which is smaller.
Mm-hmm.
So like some people are attributing the fact that Ngannou won the fight much easier, partly due to the fact that the octagon size was smaller, so
Yeah.
Stipe didn't have as much space to move around. I mean, you can argue against that, of course you can, but
He's also really good at
um,
sending people to the shadow realm.
he is.
I, I'm actually inclined to think that worked against Stipe, because those smaller arenas do tend to favor grapplers, because you end up
Or you
being
think
pushed.
it worked in the opposite way? You think Stipe could have benefited more?
You know what? Actually, I am starting to rethink that. Typically, though, smaller cages help the grapplers, but I guess
Yeah.
Ngannou's style has never been a keep you on the end of his range and stick you with jabs.
That's why it's John Jones,
Yeah.
isn't it? John Jones wants the bigger cage because he wants to be on the back foot, countering, moving away because he's great at distance. The smaller cage, same with Ngannou Stipe, is it gives Ngannou less of a having to chase you around, gives you less exit opportunities against the cage because you are going to be pushed back to the cage, more chance of being caught. So I think that's where people give kind of Ngannou the benefit, but then I also think his improvement from the first fight, from being able to stop the takedown, was one of the biggest drivers of winning that.
Yeah, I don't think the main reason he won that fight was anything to do with the arena or the environment. I think that's just to do with their skills.
No.
But it is true. Like put people in a tiny little cage, and you further help the grappler normally, or at least the guy who wants to be close, whether that's clinching or whatever. Because the smaller the cages, the less people can maintain distance. The more scrappy you make it, the more you force people to engage.
Yeah.
I think distance is a big one because if we're going back to rules and rule sets, and I think we agree about the kind of UFC one knees to the head not being too different. The biggest one I've always seen as the biggest change in rule sets, and like you see a disparity when it changes, is from amateur MMA to pro, when you're allowed to elbow in the clinch.
What do you think that changes in terms of the style?
So you get a lot of kind of underhooks, you get a lot of people against the cage. You look at like Leon Edwards, his game is on the break from the clinch, big elbow. Don't come back here because you're going to get fucking elbowed. For a person who's fought 10, 15, 20 amateur fights, they're not used to elbows on the break. And like you say, the instinct of they just carrying on fighting. I think there's a switch you need to learn when you switch from amateur to pro to go, you can't be sloppy on your exits from clinch, especially against the cage, because you can get elbowed quite easily. Or even like not having good head position. You see loads of people create the frame and then elbow over the top.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a big shift that people have to do when they move from amateur to pro. It might be a reason that some people, because we all know some people who just can't make that transition.
Yep.
I mean, you also, I guess, see in other sports like Thai boxing, where you like for just the sole use of elbows is not allowed until you get to, what is it, class A, or
Yeah.
just in white. I guess if you're in Thailand, you're always allowed to, but if in the Western world, let's say, there are classes where you're not allowed to use them,
Yeah, because
and
then you get C
that
class,
can,
take the shin pads off. B class, you can knee them in the head. Then A class is
yeah.
full Thai rules.
And those are massively different ways of fighting, and even just not having shin pads can really influence your ways, especially if you're not used to impacting with shins on other shins, or even someone's arms. It can definitely shift the way you fight.
I was always interested in the idea of because wasn't UFC one? Wasn't it no time limit finish only? Except, oh wait, no, UFC one did have rounds. It was some of the later ones were just like no time limit, finish only. I was always interested as to what would happen if it was more like those rules. I imagine that was like the old Vale Tudo rules, like back in Brazil, like pre-UFC days. I imagine that might be partly why Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was so successful. Consider like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu versus wrestling and boxing. Obviously people can get the knockout of boxing, but most boxing is to do more with scoring points, racking up damage, becoming evasive. Whereas Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's about control and it's about submissions. If you have to finish the fight, I reckon if you only had to finish the fight, I reckon you'd see a big shift towards things like probably like Muay Thai and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's either going to be those ones that damage you more or the ones that have a purely finishing aspect, and away from things like wrestling, which is about control. And yes, sure, people do get damage with ground and pound, and obviously Khabib had a style that focused on wrestling with finishes, but a lot of wrestlers aren't like that. A lot of wrestlers are more just about landing sort of accumulative damage with ground and pound. Whereas I think like things like Muay Thai, for example, even elbows and stuff like that are far more effective at finishing opponents than sort of just straight up punching.
As there will, Muay Thai is a big example. When you see somebody catch a good elbow, you always see the excitement in the face and they point at them and say, I've got you, because you know there's a good chance the referee's going to have to get involved because you've just sliced your forehead. I think with the rules, like you're saying, modern wrestling is about, it is about control, but it's about winning rounds, because that's the confines of the rule set. Is you win 3 out of 4 rounds, you win the title fight or whatever. Like, it's making sure you do enough to win the fight under the rule set. I think if you went to no time limit, finish only, you probably would see a switch. But then also, like, cardio is going to play a huge part in that.
Yeah, you know what? You'd probably start seeing a lot leaner guys, because if you have to last longer, you'd move away from those like heavily muscled guys, even if they can get the finish, because whenever they can't, it ain't going to go well.
Yeah, what does Francis Ngannou look like in hour 2?
Hour 2.
Yeah. I mean, what? Pride was 9 minutes, right? Long. There were like 9
first
minute
round.
First round was 10 minutes.
Yeah. So that's, I guess you're still, that's a long time though.
I like that,
even that. I mean, it's no time limit, but it's quite a long round.
I like that though, because the 5-minute thing feels really artificial. Like, it's get up and go back and have a rest and then come back.
Hey, I could say a ton about the rounds. You know what? The rounds, I think the UFC will never get rid of rounds, and there's 2 reasons for it. First one, advertising, money making. But to focus more on the fight side of things, the rounds favor strikers massively favor strikers,
usually.
right? For obvious reasons. And it's the same reason why the UFC will never get rid of gloves. I mean, there are other reasons to not get rid of gloves, mostly the gore aspect and longevity of fighters' hands, which is more important on the UFC's timeline than longevity of people's brains.
And healing cuts.
Yeah, scar tissue.
Yeah, and healing cuts, right? All sorts of reasons. But the thing is, within the fight itself, having rounds where you stand people up in between and you give them a rest, gives you more energy to fight. But it also means that those strikers are favoured. Having gloves also means strikers are massively favoured, and we kind of all know that as realistic as the UFC kind of wants to be, they also just want strikers. Because it's easier to market, it's easier for casuals to appreciate, and I wonder if the UFC had never picked
and I think
up...
it's also part. I think it's also in part that Dana White has such a big background in boxing, that he probably has steered the company that way as well.
Yeah, well, that's why they're going to have 3 rounds. That's why they have the ring girls. That's why they have all sorts of things that are adopted from boxing. But I mean, it would just make no sense for them rule set wise, because it'd be harder to market, it'd be harder to promote the UFC. If you'd move to one long, like just 1 round, like no rounds, however you want to word it, and no gloves, that would be far more realistic. Far more realistic. But you know what? It's never going to happen. But it'd be interesting to see
I
how the
don't know, mate. The pubs have
styles would
now
change.
opened in London. The pubs have now opened in London. You could probably go and see some of a weekend.
I mean, there is that.
No, I agree though. It is the the rules are dictated by the ownership and the promotion, and that drives kind of trends in behavior. Because if you want to be successful in one of two, three big organizations, you've got to win on their terms, and the UFC are always going to drive it towards their bottom line because they want more money. But I don't think a 15-minute round with no breaks the answer.
I am not necessarily saying that, but I am saying that's more like a real fight.
Mm-hmm.
But also, you would get more finishes. They might be more. It's either going to be TKOs or submission finishes, but you would get more finishes
Well,
that way.
I think something like, I mean, we've spoken about Faraz many times, and although he's not my, go-to guru, he does have some good points about the general sport of MMA, and maybe something like what you're talking about with the rounds favoring strikers massively. If you were to introduce something like when you're leaving a position at the end of a round, you go back to that position at the start of the new round. I mean, that I think that would probably um, influence things
Grapplers.
a bit more. Yeah, it would influence grapplers. I wonder if it would really change styles. I mean, people people want to take people down and go for. Yeah, I guess it would affect how you fight, because if you know you've got only 10 seconds, you're gonna try and do something, and if you know you're gonna have the position again, actually maybe it would make things a bit more boring. I don't know.
Does it make the problem? Does it perpetuate the problem that I think Dana White has a big issue with, where you do a takedown in the last 30 seconds to steal the round if it's close? And it's like, in the last 30 seconds, if you're a wrestler, go hell for leather to get on top because you're going to get a minute rest and put back in that position. Are you just going to get the last 30 seconds of every round just being a chaotic scramble?
That is a good point. But that's interesting, isn't it? Like the way you'd make a subtle change, start in the old position, not reset the size of the cage.
Mm-hmm.
But it wouldn't just be individual mad scrambles. Everyone would work on wrestling more. Everyone would, because it'd be so much more powerful through that slight change. That's the sort of stuff that interests me, and that's why I don't think the knees to the head make a big difference. Because really, what skills do you need to pick up? Like, not much, right? It's not much different to what you do now to be able to knee someone in the head. However, if takedowns were that much more powerful, or if striking was a bit less powerful, you'd have such a huge trend in one direction in the sport. The way people fight over the course of 5-10 years would just change colossally.
Does the knees to the head bring the pendulum a little bit back more in the favor of the wrestler?
Physical angle, like an interesting it's a slight change in the meta for wrestlers, and it allows a sort of new strategies to be brought into play, which could be very interesting. I don't think it's such a dominant rule shift that it would sort of swing it in the favor of wrestlers per se. It's just an extra tool for wrestlers to use.
I think it
If
gives
that
a
makes sense.
big risk and reward to wrestlers because the risk is great. If you knee somebody in the head, you're going to give up control, you're going to give up a position, but the reward is actually also quite large in terms of you can easily knock people out that way. So they have to. Are they a big risk taker on top, or do they stall out and try and win a round?
Well, hey, it would stop people turtling. Imagine a front headlock position.
Exactly, yeah.
Fuck.
It's interesting, and I would be interested to see what kind of strategies wrestlers come up with in one championship. Because, to be quite frank, there aren't many good wrestlers.
No, not yet.
The more that come in, though, there could be some interesting styles and some interesting strategies that sort of come into play just from that one rule change. Maybe it would favour the wrestlers.
I know you said the UFC's rule set is heavily favoured for the striker, but that's not indicative of like the champions, is it? Like wrestling still is disproportionately more dominant.
So who have we got?
Or it plays a big
I mean,
part.
I don't know. I mean, even someone like Kamaru, he's pretty heavy on striking.
Kamaru's a big wrestler.
No, I'd say out of everyone you could pick, Usman is the most. He has got such dominant control time and like ground and pound strikes. I think out of how did you pick Kamaru out of any of the champions? Like Weili Zhang, Francis Ngannou, Israel
I love how you jumped from
Adesanya.
one end of the spectrum to the other there.
That was the point.
I thought he was going to go up the weights.
Jan Blachowicz, they're all striking heavy, even if they have well, actually less of them have a wrestling background now. Take it 2 years ago, yeah, a lot of them were really heavily wrestling background, but even then they were.
I mean, you give me shit about Kamaru, but he won that fight mainly because of his jab.
Yeah, I'm not saying he isn't a good striker, but I would say that most of his best work is done
Through control, yeah. No, I don't disagree. Yeah, I don't disagree.
His fear,
but it's
his
not
fear
also
with Burns was the takedown. He didn't want to get stuck on top and get caught in something. So I think that's a kind of like an erroneous data point because that was a very specific game plan for one person. And I agree, his striking looked really good. I think what you'll see though is return to form against Masvidal because he knows he's safe.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think you're right. I think, but the rest. I mean, yeah. Other than that, there isn't. Yeah, of course, Khabib, who was a champion, no longer. But yeah. I mean, most of them are strikers.
Okay, so even if don't take the champions, then take the upper echelons of divisions. Wrestling's still pretty well populated in there.
God, well, it's hard to think of the entire UFC roster
Yeah.
top 10 of
what I'm trying
every
to say
division.
is wrestling hasn't become redundant because the rule set's made against them.
No, not at all. But like, what are we comparing it to? At the end of the day, aren't we comparing it to like real fighting, right? And not like in the street, like real one-on-one fighting. Like the most honest thing you could do is throw them in there with no gloves, no rounds.
Yeah.
And like no rules, you would end up with a far more heavily grappling based style than you do now. It's all what you're comparing it to, and we're not comparing it to like boxing or whatever.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, fair.
So I think the UFC does, their specific rule set does really heavily favour strikers. I wonder if they're going to make any changes in the future. I know it's not the UFC per se that dictates the rules, but I'm sure they have a huge influence on it.
Yeah, I mean, if you can't get them to change the gloves and they're still doing the 12-6 rule because it was on a karate video, I think they're content with just leaving it as is. Like, when was the last time in the UFC a rule change happened?
Like 3 years ago or something.
Which was
knees to the head of the ground opponent, a change in the scoring system to favour damage.
So the only one I can think they've actually changed really is the hand position for knees to a downed opponent.
Yeah, definition of grounded opponent. That was a slight change.
But that sounds more like a clarification than a rule change. Like I think what I'm trying to say is, when was a big fundamental rule change really done? They're very few and far between.
No,
you're right. You are right. Maybe my question about what rule change is going to happen, that kind of answered it. Probably answered.
But isn't the UFC a lot when they, I don't know, do they define the rule sets, or is it the athletic commissions that govern rule sets?
Depends where the show is. So if it's in the US and there's an athletic commission, it's done by the athletic commission. But when they come over to the UK or Poland or wherever, they become their own commission. So there's been loads of people pushing for them to try rule sets when they go abroad or whatever, because they then have the freedom to do it. And I won't get into my opinions of that.
Yeah. So they just keep to it partly because they're just an American-based organization.
Mm-hmm. But I think they're the only body that has the power to lobby the athletic commissions to change rules.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest here. They might not be the dictators for the rules, but they are going to very heavily influence them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how could they
Absolutely.
not? I'm not sure if we're going to find a conclusion to this podcast. I feel like we're going to start rambling on about interesting stuff. But I mean, I guess the summary is it's just interesting to see how styles have changed to fit the rules, and like as you've moved away from the finish only rule set and to a round based and gloved rule set. There has been a huge shift towards striking, and cyclic as it may be, I don't think you're going to see a shift back to grappling to the extent as we saw grappling being dominant in the early days of the UFC. I just never think you're going to get back to that now because of the rule set that we've got in place.
I don't know, get more of the Danaher Death Squad into MMA and we'll see.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please consider subscribing to the podcast and checking us out on YouTube, Facebook and Instagram under the name Combat Thoughts. We'll see you next time.